What happens when the architect of an ideology that promised eternal glory ends up hanging upside down in a public square, beaten by the same masses that once adored him? How can the founder of fascism, the leader who inspired Adolf Hitler, go from being one of the most powerful dictators in Europe to becoming a corpse displayed as a war trophy in less than 2 years? The answer to these questions lies buried in the archives of World War II, in the testimonies of those who witnessed his fall, and in the fatal decisions that sealed the fate of Benito Mussolini. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. The story we are about to explore is not simply the chronicle of a violent death. It is the tale of how an empire built on propaganda, violence, and empty promises collapsed like a house of cards when the reality of war knocked on its doors. It is the story of betrayals, of broken loyalties, of a dictator who believed that his alliance with Nazi Germany would make him the master of the Mediterranean, only to discover that he had signed his own death warrant. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born on the 29th of July, 1883 in Dovia di Predapio, a small town in the Emilia-Romagna region in northern Italy. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith and a fervent socialist who named his son in memory of Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary who fought against the French intervention. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, worked as a primary school teacher and represented the exact opposite of her husband. She was a devout Catholic, disciplined, and firmly believed in education as a means of social mobility. This duality between the revolutionary father and the conservative mother would profoundly mark the contradictory personality of the future dictator. Why do we mention these humble origins? Because understanding where Mussolini came from is fundamental to understanding the insecurities that drove him to seek glory at any price, even at the cost of his own destruction. Little Benito grew up listening to his father's political diatribes against the rich and the powerful, but also observing the poverty that surrounded his family. This mixture of social resentment and boundless ambition would become the fuel that would power his rise to power. During his childhood, Mussolini showed a violent temperament that worried those around him. At the age of 10, he was expelled from a religious boarding school for stabbing a classmate with a knife. Later, in another school, he was involved in a similar incident again. His biographers point out that from a very young age, Benito understood that violence was an effective tool to get what he wanted. He would never forget this lesson. But let's go back for a moment and ask ourselves a crucial question. How did this blacksmith's son become Adolf Hitler's closest ally? What path did he have to travel to go from being a marginalized socialist agitator to sitting at the table of the most powerful dictators in Europe? The answer will take us through decades of political convulsion, of an Italy humiliated after World War I, and of a desperate people who found in Mussolini's grandiloquent promises the illusion of a glorious future. At 18, Mussolini emigrated to Switzerland to avoid mandatory military service. For 2 years he wandered through the Alpine country, working as a bricklayer, as a butcher's assistant, and sleeping under bridges when he couldn't find employment. It was in Switzerland that he began to voraciously read socialist thinkers, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Georges Sorel. He absorbed ideas from everywhere, mixing them into an ideological cocktail that he would later use to build his own doctrine. He was deported from Switzerland on multiple occasions for organizing strikes and fomenting political agitation among emigrated Italian workers. Upon returning to Italy, Mussolini became an agitator journalist. His pen was sharp, his words incendiary. He edited socialist newspapers and gained fame for his fierce attacks against the Italian monarchy, against the Catholic Church, against capitalism. In 1912, at 29 years old, he was already a well-known figure in left-wing Italian circles. He directed Avanti, the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, and his influence grew day by day. What led this convinced socialist then to become the father of fascism, an ideology diametrically opposed to everything he had defended. The breaking point came with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. When the European powers plunged into war, Italy initially remained neutral, despite its commitments to the Triple Alliance that bound it to Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Italian Socialist Party adopted a firmly anti-war stance, but Mussolini began to change his mind. He started to argue that Italy should enter the war on the side of France and Great Britain, not for democratic ideals, but because he saw the conflict as an opportunity for revolution. War, according to Mussolini's new thinking, would shake up social structures and create the conditions for radical change. This position put him directly at odds with his socialist comrades. In November 1914, Mussolini was expelled from the Socialist Party for his interventionist stance. His former comrades considered him a traitor sold out to bourgeois interests. But Mussolini was not intimidated. He founded his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, financed in part by Italian industrialists, and according to some historians, also by French intelligence services interested in getting Italy to enter the war. The betrayal of his socialist ideals would set the pattern that would define the rest of his political life. Mussolini was willing to change his position, to ally with whoever was necessary, to say whatever was convenient, as long as he could achieve and maintain power. This ideological flexibility, which he presented as pragmatism, would be admired by a young Austrian agitator who watched the Italians rise from afar, Adolf Hitler. When Italy finally entered the war in May 1915, Mussolini enlisted as a volunteer. He served in the trenches of the Alpine Front against Austria-Hungary, reaching the rank of corporal. In February 1917, he was severely wounded when an Italian mortar accidentally exploded during a training exercise. Shrapnel fragments were embedded in his body. He had to undergo multiple surgeries and spent months recovering. This war experience, although brief and not particularly heroic, would provide him with veteran credentials that he would politically exploit for years. World War I ended in November 1918, with the defeat of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy was technically among the victors, but the peace negotiations at Versailles brought deep disappointment. The Allies did not fulfill the territorial promises they had made to Italy to convince it to enter the war. The country had sacrificed over 600,000 dead soldiers and more than 1 million wounded, but did not receive the territories it considered rightfully its own. This feeling of a mutilated victory, of unrewarded sacrifice, created a perfect breeding ground for nationalist resentment. Does this scenario sound familiar? A country humiliated after a war, a frustrated population, veterans who feel their sacrifice was in vain, a faltering economy unable to reintegrate demobilized soldiers. Exactly the same conditions that existed in Germany, where an Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler was beginning to take his first steps in politics. On the 23rd of March, 1919, in a small hall in Milan located in Piazza San Sepolcro, Mussolini founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. The name derived from the fasces, an ancient Roman symbol representing a bundle of rods tied around an axe, an emblem of the authority of Roman magistrates. Barely 100 people attended that founding meeting, but what was born that day would change the history of the 20th century. The initial program of the fascist movement was confusing, contradictory, almost incoherent. It mixed left-wing demands such as women's suffrage, an 8-hour workday, and the confiscation of war profits, with aggressive nationalism and a visceral rejection of organized socialism. But Mussolini understood something fundamental. In times of crisis, people do not seek ideological coherence. They seek strong leadership. They seek someone to tell them that everything will be fine, that their problems have identifiable culprits, and that he knows how to solve them. The early years of fascism were turbulent. Fascist squads, known as squadristi or black shirts, dedicated themselves to attacking socialists, communists, and trade unionists. They They burned down Union headquarters, beat up opponents, assassinated left-wing leaders. This systematic violence had the tacit complicity of the authorities, of the landowners who saw the fascists as a useful force against organized peasants, and of the industrialists who generously financed the movement. By 1922, Italy was on the brink of collapse. Strikes paralyzed cities, the government was incapable of maintaining order, and the fascists paradoxically presented themselves as the only force capable of restoring the stability that they themselves were helping to destroy. In October of that year, Mussolini decided to strike the decisive blow. The March on Rome is one of the most mythologized and misunderstood events in modern history. What really happened between the 27th and 30th of October 1922? Fascist history books presented an epic image, tens of thousands of black shirts converging on the capital, ready to take power by force, with Mussolini at the helm like a new Caesar. The reality was much more prosaic. Approximately 30,000 fascists mobilized toward Rome from different parts of Italy. Many were poorly armed, poorly organized, soaked by the rain. The Italian army could have easily dispersed them if King Victor Emmanuel III had ordered the government to declare a state of siege. But the monarch, fearful of a civil war or perhaps sympathetic to fascism, refused to sign the decree. Prime Minister Luigi Facta submitted his resignation, and the king, in a decision that would seal the fate of Italy and Europe, invited Benito Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini didn't even participate in the march. He waited comfortably in Milan until receiving the royal invitation and then travelled to Rome by night train. He arrived in the capital on the morning of October the 30th, elegantly dressed, to present himself before the king and accept the mandate to form a government. He was 39 years old. Why is it important to dismantle the myth of the March on Rome? Because it reveals a fundamental truth about fascism that is often forgotten. Mussolini did not seize power through a violent revolution, but it was handed to him by Italian elites who believed they could use him for their own ends. Industrialists thought they could control him. Landowners believed he would be their tool against organized peasants. The king imagined he would be a manageable prime minister. They were all wrong. During his first 2 years in government, Mussolini maintained a facade of legality. He governed in coalition with other parties, formally respected parliamentary institutions, and reassured international critics. But gradually he consolidated his power, silencing the opposition, controlling the press, transforming the Italian state into a one-party dictatorship. The decisive moment came with the assassination of Giacomo Matteotti in June 1924. Matteotti was a socialist deputy who had publicly denounced fascist fraud and violence in the elections. 10 days after delivering a devastating speech in Parliament, he was kidnapped in the middle of a Roman street by a group of fascists and stabbed to death. His body appeared 2 months later in a forest outside the city. The assassination provoked an unprecedented political crisis. Opposition parties abandoned Parliament in protest. International public opinion was horrified, and for a moment it seemed the fascist regime would crumble. But the opposition made a fatal mistake. They waited for the king to act, for institutions to react, for something or someone to stop Mussolini. No one did. On the 3rd of January 1925, Mussolini delivered a speech before Parliament that marked the point of no return. He assumed full political, moral, and historical responsibility for everything that had happened in Italy, implicitly including the murder of Matteotti. He dared his opponents to formally accuse him if they dared. No one did. From that moment on, he abandoned all democratic pretense and openly established a dictatorship. Why do we dedicate so much space to this background? Because without understanding how Mussolini came to power and how he consolidated it, it is impossible to understand his alliance with Hitler, the decisions he made during World War II, and finally his spectacular fall. Each of these elements is connected to the next in a chain of cause and effect that would culminate 2 decades later at an abandoned gas station near Lake Como. During the 1920s, while Mussolini transformed Italy into the first fascist state in Europe, a distant disciple watched and learned. Adolf Hitler deeply admired Mussolini. The Italian dictator had shown that it was possible to reach power using violent methods while maintaining a facade of legality. He had created a model that Hitler was determined to replicate in Germany. In 1923, inspired by the March on Rome, Hitler attempted his own coup d'état in Munich. The beer hall putsch failed miserably. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. But his admiration for Mussolini did not diminish. When Hitler finally came to power in January 1933, one of his first objectives was to establish an alliance with fascist Italy. The relationship between Hitler and Mussolini is fascinating precisely because it began with a clear asymmetry. In the 1920s and early 30s, Mussolini was the master and Hitler the student. The Italian had been in power for a decade when the German was just starting. Italian fascism was the original model, Nazism a Germanic adaptation with its own characteristics. Mussolini saw himself as the natural leader of European fascism, with Hitler as an enthusiastic but subordinate follower. This perception began to change rapidly after 1933. Germany was a much larger, more industrialized, more populated country than Italy. As the Nazi regime consolidated its power and began to rearm aggressively, the balance of power between the two dictators inevitably shifted toward Hitler. The first personal meeting between Mussolini and Hitler occurred in Venice in June 1934. The Italian prepared a grandiose reception, determined to impress and dominate his visitor. But the meeting did not go as Mussolini expected. Hitler arrived nervous, wearing a wrinkled raincoat and a soft hat that contrasted ridiculously with Mussolini's impeccable uniform. During the conversations, the Führer talked non-stop, rambling about his racial theories, his hatred for the Jews, his plans for Europe. Mussolini, who did not speak fluent German, could barely intervene. After the meeting, Mussolini confided to his collaborators his disappointment with Hitler. He described him as a charlatan, a lunatic obsessed with absurd racial theories. He mocked his appearance, his nervousness, his inability to listen. But despite his personal reservations, Mussolini understood that Germany was a potential ally too valuable to ignore. What would have happened if Mussolini had followed his initial instinct and kept his distance from Hitler? Could Italy have avoided the disaster of World War II? These are questions historians have debated for decades. What we know for sure is that Mussolini chose the path of the alliance, and that decision would determine his fate. The following years saw a gradual rapprochement between the two regimes. In October 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, the last independent African state, in a brutal colonial war that included the use of chemical weapons against civilians. The League of Nations imposed economic sanctions on Italy, but these measures were timid and ineffective. However, the international isolation pushed Mussolini into Hitler's arms. In October 1936, the two countries signed a cooperation agreement that Mussolini baptized as the Rome-Berlin Axis. In a phrase that would become famous, the Italian dictator declared that Europe would now revolve around this new axis. He didn't know he was describing the rope that would eventually hang him. The relationship between the two dictators deepened in the following years. In September 1937, Mussolini made a state visit to Germany that impressed him deeply. Hitler organized massive military parades, exhibitions of industrial power, mass gatherings that left the Italians speechless. For the first time, Mussolini realized that Germany had surpassed him. The student had become the master. When Hitler annexed Austria in March 1938, Mussolini did not protest, even though he had previously declared he would defend Austrian independence. When Germany dismembered Czechoslovakia in September of the same year, Italy participated in the Munich conference as Germany's ally. Mussolini's dependence on Hitler grew day by day. In May 1939, the two countries signed the Pact of Steel, a military alliance that committed each to support the other in case of war, regardless of who started it. Mussolini hesitated before signing. His generals warned him that Italy was not prepared for a European war, that it would need at least 3 years to modernize its army. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, expressed serious reservations, but the dictator ignored all warnings and signed the pact, definitively tying Italy's fate to Germany's. Why did Mussolini make this seemingly suicidal decision? Historians have proposed multiple explanations. Some point to his vanity. He wanted to be seen as the leader of a great power, and equal to Hitler. Others point to his ideology. He genuinely believed that fascism was destined to triumph over decadent democracies. Some suggest he underestimated the determination of Great Britain and France to resist German aggression. Probably all these reasons played a role. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, unleashing World War II, Italy stayed on the sidelines. Despite the Pact of Steel, Mussolini declared Italian non-belligerence. His generals had been clear. The Italian army was not ready. Nevertheless, this neutrality would not last long. For 9 months, Mussolini watched helplessly as Germany crushed Poland, conquered Denmark and Norway, and prepared for the offensive against France. The Italian dictator felt humiliated. While Hitler reaped spectacular military victories, he remained in the rearguard, reduced to the role of a spectator. The inferiority complex that had accompanied him his whole life, from his humble origins to his late recognition as a political leader, resurfaced strongly. On the 10th of June, 1940, when German troops were already at the gates of Paris and French defeat was imminent, Mussolini declared war on France and Great Britain. His famous phrase perfectly summarizes his motivation. He needed a few thousand dead to sit at the peace table. The cynicism of this declaration is chilling, but it reveals the true nature of the decision. It was not about strategic or ideological interests, but the wounded vanity of a dictator who couldn't stand being left out of the division of the spoils. Italy's entry into the war was a disaster from day one. The attack against France, launched when the French nation was already practically defeated, stalled against the Alpine defences. Italian troops suffered significant casualties without achieving major advances. Hitler felt obligated to intervene in the armistice negotiations to save some of Italian pride. But this was only the beginning of a series of military failures that would erode both Mussolini's prestige and Hitler's patience. In September 1940, Italian forces invaded Egypt from Libya, with the goal of conquering the Suez Canal. The offensive halted after advancing barely 100 kilometres, and in December the British counterattacked, destroying 10 Italian divisions and capturing more than 130,000 prisoners. On the 28th of October 1940, without consulting Hitler, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from Albania. The Italian dictator wanted to prove that he could achieve independent victories, that he did not need German tutelage. The result was catastrophic. The Greek forces, vastly inferior in number and equipment, repelled the invasion and counterattacked, pushing the Italians back to Albania. It was an unprecedented humiliation. Hitler was furious. Mussolini's Greek adventure had complicated his strategic plans, forcing him to divert troops to the Balkans. In April 1941, Germany had to intervene militarily to save Italy, conquering Yugoslavia and Greece in a few weeks. But this diversion delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was scheduled for May and did not begin until the 22nd of June. Some historians argue that these crucial weeks of delay contributed to the German failure to capture Moscow before winter. From 1941 onwards, the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler changed definitively. The Italian was no longer an ally on equal terms, but a problematic subordinate whose forces required constant German rescue. In North Africa, Rommel and his Afrika Korps had to take over a campaign the Italians had lost. In Russia, The Italian divisions sent to the Eastern Front suffered catastrophic losses during the Soviet winter offensive of 1942 to 1943. How did the Italian people experience this succession of defeats? At first, fascist propaganda managed to hide the magnitude of the disasters, but gradually reality filtered through. Soldiers wrote letters home describing terrible conditions, lack of equipment, incompetent leadership. Prisoners of war captured by the British in North Africa began to be repatriated, bringing with them stories of crushing defeats. And above all, Italian cities began to suffer Allied bombings. The first major bombing of an Italian city occurred in Turin in November 1942. From then on, the attacks intensified. Milan, Genoa, Naples, Rome itself were struck repeatedly. The civilian population, which had applauded Mussolini's imperial adventures when they seemed cost-free, now paid the price in destruction and death. The economic situation also deteriorated rapidly. Italy depended on imports for many basic products, and the Allied blockade strangled the economy. Rationing became increasingly strict. Black market prices skyrocketed. The population began to murmur against the regime, something unthinkable a few years earlier. In this context of military defeats, bombings, and privations, the cracks in the fascist edifice began to become visible. Within the fascist party itself, some hierarchs began to question the conduct of the war and the alliance with Germany. The most important of these dissidents was Count Dino Grandi, one of the founders of fascism and former ambassador to London, who believed that Italy had to seek a negotiated exit from the conflict before it was too late. But Mussolini wouldn't listen. Locked in his palaces, surrounded by sycophants, the dictator refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. When his generals warned him about the army's deficiencies, he fired or transferred them. When intelligence reports indicated growing Allied superiority, he dismissed them as defeatism. Mussolini had spent 2 decades believing his own propaganda. Now he was unable to distinguish reality from fiction. The turning point came in July 1943. On July 10th, Allied forces landed in Sicily, the first invasion of metropolitan Italian territory. Coastal defences collapsed rapidly. The Italian divisions, demoralised and poorly equipped, offered minimal resistance. In a few weeks, the island fell into Allied hands. What was Mussolini thinking while he watched his empire crumble? The diaries and memoirs of those around him in those days paint a disturbing picture. The dictator alternated between outbursts of irrational fury and periods of total apathy. He suffered from severe stomach ulcers that barely allowed him to eat. He took large quantities of medications. Some historians have suggested he suffered from some kind of mental disorder exacerbated by stress and drugs. On July 19th, Mussolini met with Hitler in Feltre in northern Italy. It was a pathetic encounter. The Führer talked for hours about counter-offensive plans, about miracle weapons that would change the course of the war, about the need to resist to the end. Mussolini barely intervened. He was physically exhausted, mentally drained, incapable of confronting his ally with the reality of the Italian situation. During the meeting, the news arrived that Rome was being bombed. It was the first time the Italian capital suffered a major air attack. Hundreds of people died. The working-class neighbourhood of San Lorenzo was devastated. The images of the damaged Basilica of San Lorenzo outside the walls shocked Italians, especially Catholics. Upon returning to Rome, Mussolini found a terrified and enraged city. The smoking ruins of the San Lorenzo neighbourhood were a visible testament to the failure of his leadership. For the first time, the idea that Italy had to exit the war, with or without Mussolini, began to circulate openly. Within the Grand Council of Fascism, the supreme organ of the party, the conspirators were making their move. Dino Grandi had drafted a motion that, if approved, would strip Mussolini of the command of the armed forces and return it to the king. It wasn't formally a motion of no confidence against the dictator, but in practice, it meant the end of his absolute power. The session of the Grand Council was convened for the night of July the 24th, 1943. It was the first meeting of the body in over 3 years. Mussolini, despite the warnings of his loyalists, agreed to convene it. Perhaps he believed he could control the situation with his oratory. Perhaps he underestimated the determination of his internal enemies. Or perhaps, exhausted and sick, he no longer cared. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This will encourage us to bring more historical topics and will also help with the video's engagement. Okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. The session began at 5 in the afternoon at Palazzo Venezia, the seat of the fascist government in the centre of Rome. Around the table sat 28 members of the Grand Council, the elite of Italian fascism. Mussolini took the floor first, defending his conduct of the war, blaming incompetent generals, assuring that the situation could be reversed. He spoke for 2 hours. But this time his oratorical magic didn't work. One after another, the council members took the floor to criticise the management of the war, the alliance with Germany, Mussolini's isolation from the Italian people. Dino Grandi was particularly harsh, accusing the dictator of leading Italy to ruin and demanding a change of course. The discussion lasted all night. Around 2 in the morning on July 25th, Grandi's motion was put to a vote. The result was devastating for Mussolini. 19 votes in favour, 7 against, 1 abstention. The majority of the Grand Council of Fascism, the organ he himself had created, had withdrawn its confidence in him. What did Mussolini feel at that moment? Sources diverge. Some witnesses claim he remained calm, merely declaring the session closed and withdrawing in silence. Others suggest he was visibly perturbed, realising that his 2-decade reign had just ended. What we do know is that he took no action to defend himself, to arrest the conspirators, to mobilise the forces that were still loyal to him. The next day, July 25th, 1943, Mussolini attended his usual audience with the King Victor Emmanuel III at the Villa Savoia. He perhaps expected the monarch to support him, to invalidate the Grand Council's vote, but the king had other plans. The conversation was brief. Victor Emmanuel informed Mussolini that he had decided to accept his resignation and appoint Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new head of government. The dictator was stunned. He hadn't submitted any resignation. He tried to protest, but the king was inflexible. Italy needed a change, he said. The war had to end. Upon leaving the audience, Mussolini was approached by a carabinieri officer, who, with extreme courtesy, informed him that the king had ordered his personal protection. In reality, he was under arrest. He was led into a military ambulance and transferred to a barracks. Thus, without firing a single shot, without any resistance, 21 years of fascist dictatorship ended. The news of Mussolini's fall spread rapidly through Italy. The reactions were extraordinary. In cities all over the country, crowds took to the streets to celebrate. Fascist symbols were torn down and destroyed. The busts of Mussolini that adorned public squares and buildings were toppled. The portraits of the dictator that hung in offices, schools, and homes were burned. 20 years of forced adoration were transformed into hours of furious repudiation. Where were the millions of fascists who had sworn eternal loyalty to the Duce? Where were the black shirts who had terrorized opponents for 2 decades? They disappeared as if by magic. The fascist hierarchs hid or fled. Party officials rushed to burn their membership cards. Journalists who had praised the regime suddenly discovered they had always been secret critics. This instantaneous transformation reveals something profound about the nature of dictatorships. The support that seemed rock solid was actually fragile as glass. The allegiance expressed in massive rallies was largely forced or faked. When the fear disappeared, so did the facade of unanimity. But Mussolini's fall did not mean the end of Italy's problems, rather the beginning of a new phase of its ordeal. Badoglio's government proclaimed that the war continued alongside Germany, but secretly began negotiating with the Allies. This double dealing would last 45 days, during which Italy lived in an absurd limbo, officially allied with Germany, unofficially seeking to switch sides. Hitler was no fool. From the moment he learned of Mussolini's fall, he understood that Italy was preparing to abandon the Axis. He immediately ordered the dispatch of additional German troops to Italy, supposedly to reinforce defences against the Allied invasion, but in reality to prepare to take control of the country when the inevitable betrayal occurred. On September 8, 1943, Badoglio's government finally announced the armistice with the Allies. General Eisenhower, commander of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean, made the agreement public from Algiers. Italy had changed sides. The German reaction was swift. German troops already positioned in Italy disarmed Italian units, capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were sent as forced labourers to Germany. The Italian fleet managed to escape to Allied ports, but the army disintegrated in a matter of days. The king and Badoglio's government fled Rome toward the south, seeking the protection of the Allied forces advancing from Sicily. They abandoned millions of Italians in German-controlled zones to their fate. They gave no clear orders to the armed forces on how to act. The result was total chaos. In Rome, Italian soldiers and civilians tried to resist the German occupation. The most intense fighting took place in the Porta San Paolo area, where regular troops and civilian volunteers fought against German paratroopers. But without leadership, without a plan, without coordination, the resistance was crushed. By September 10th, Rome was firmly in German hands. And what had happened to Mussolini during all these events? The deposed dictator had been moved from one detention place to another, in an attempt by the Badoglio government to keep him hidden from the Germans. First, they took him to the island of Ponza, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, then to the island of La Maddalena, off Sardinia. Finally, to the Gran Sasso, a mountain in the Apennines, where there was a ski resort accessible only by cable car. The Italian government didn't know what to do with its prisoner. Killing him would have been legally and politically problematic. Handing him over to the Allies would have infuriated the Germans. Keeping him indefinitely detained was risky. While they deliberated, Hitler took the initiative. The Führer was determined to rescue his former ally, even if only for propaganda reasons. Mussolini's fall was a stain on the prestige of fascism that had to be wiped clean. Furthermore, Hitler needed Mussolini to create a puppet government in northern Italy to continue the war alongside Germany. The rescue mission was entrusted to Otto Skorzeny, an Austrian SS officer who already had a reputation as a specialist in risky special operations. For weeks, German intelligence services tried to locate Mussolini's whereabouts. Finally, they found him at the Hotel Campo Imperatore, high up on the Gran Sasso. On September 12, 1943, Skorzeny led a group of commandos in a daring assault. Silent gliders landed on the small plateau next to the hotel, surprising the Italian guards. There was no significant resistance. The Carabinieri, guarding Mussolini, confused and without orders, surrendered without a fight. Skorzeny found Mussolini in his room, dejected and dishevelled. The former dictator was sick, had lost weight, looked like an old man. When the German officer announced that he had come to rescue him on behalf of the Führer, Mussolini responded with a phrase that revealed his mental state. "I knew my friend Adolf Hitler would not abandon me." This phrase is revealing for what it says and what it omits. Mussolini did not mention Italy, did not ask about the situation of his country, expressed no desire whatsoever to retake power. He clung to the idea that Hitler was his friend, like a child seeking comfort from a father figure. The once proud Duce was completely broken. Mussolini was taken out of the hotel and put on a small plane that flew him to Vienna. From there he flew to Munich and finally met Hitler at his headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. The reunion of the two dictators was emotional but awkward. Hitler embraced Mussolini, expressed his joy at the successful rescue, promised him total support, but he also made it clear what his new role would be. Mussolini would no longer be the leader of an Allied power on equal terms. He would be the head of a puppet state completely dependent on Germany. He would govern northern Italy, the areas not yet occupied by the Allies, but under German supervision. His important decisions would require approval from Berlin. In essence, he would become a German official disguised as a national leader. Why did Mussolini accept this humiliating role? The alternatives were no better. Rejecting Hitler's offer probably meant death, or at least an existence as a prisoner until the end of the war. Accepting gave him at least the illusion of power, the possibility of taking revenge on those who had betrayed him, and perhaps the vague hope that the war could still be won. On September 23rd, 1943, Mussolini proclaimed from Munich the creation of the Italian Social Republic, a new fascist state with its capital in Salo, a small town on the shores of Lake Garda in northern Italy. For this reason, the regime would be historically known as the Republic of Salo. The Italian Social Republic was stillborn from the point of view of legitimacy and viability. It didn't truly control its territory, which was occupied by German troops. It didn't have an army worthy of the name. Its economy was subordinated to German war demands. Its population viewed it with a mix of indifference and hostility. But the Republic of Salo did have a real function, to serve as an instrument of repression against the growing Italian resistance. As the German occupation prolonged and living conditions worsened, more and more Italians joined the partisan groups fighting in the mountains. The Republic of Salo organized its own armed and security forces, which collaborated with the Germans in hunting down partisans, Jews, and political opponents. The most sinister aspect of the Republic of Salo was its participation in the Holocaust. Prior to 1943, fascist Italy had enacted racial laws discriminating against Jews, but had not participated directly in the extermination. With the German occupation and the creation of the Republic of Salo, this changed. Italian authorities actively collaborated in the deportation of Italian Jews to Nazi extermination camps. On October 16, 1943, German troops carried out a raid in the Rome ghetto, capturing over 1,000 Jews, who were sent to Auschwitz. Only 16 survived. In the following months, similar raids were carried out in other Italian cities. By the end of the war, approximately 7,500 Italian Jews had been deported, of whom only about 600 returned. Mussolini, who before the war had had an ambiguous relationship with anti-Semitism, now presided over a regime complicit in genocide. Did he know the details of what was happening in the extermination camps? Historians debate this point. What is undeniable is that he did nothing to stop the deportations, that his regime collaborated actively with the Nazis, and that he had access to information about the nature of the camps. Mussolini's life in the Republic of Salo was a twilight existence. He lived in a villa on the shores of Lake Garda, surrounded by German guards, who supposedly protected him, but in reality watched him. His health continued to deteriorate. He spent hours in melancholy, remembering past times, writing memoirs that attempted to justify his decisions. His family was fragmented. His wife Raquel lived near him, but in a separate residence, resentful of years of infidelities. His mistress Clara Petacci had joined him, moving into a nearby villa, which caused continuous scandals. His children were scattered, some in Italy, others in Germany, all in precarious situations. What did Mussolini think about his situation in those final months? The few available sources suggest a contradictory mix of fatalistic resignation and revenge fantasies. On the one hand, he seemed to accept that his time had passed, that the war was lost, that he probably wouldn't survive. On the other hand, he kept talking about reprisals against his enemies, about trials against the traitors of July 25th, about an eventual resurgence of fascism. The government of the Republic of Salo tried to present itself as a revolutionary regime, purer and more authentic than the corrupt fascism that had fallen in July. Socialist reforms were proclaimed, nationalization of industries, worker participation in company management. But these measures were empty propaganda. In practice, the Republic of Salo was a police state dedicated to repression and serving German interests. One of the most dramatic acts of the regime was the Verona trial, held in January 1944 against the members of the Grand Council, who had voted against Mussolini on July 25th. 18 people were accused of high treason. 6 of them, including Mussolini's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, were captured, tried in a summary process, and executed by firing squad. Ciano's execution was particularly tragic. He had been Minister of Foreign Affairs, one of the most important hierarchs of fascism, and was married to Edda, Mussolini's favourite daughter. Edda begged her father to spare her husband, but the Germans demanded blood, and Mussolini, whether out of cowardice, personal resentment against Ciano, or inability to resist Hitler's pressures, allowed the execution to be carried out. The relationship between Mussolini and Edda never recovered. She held him responsible for her husband's death and swore she would never forgive him. When she wrote her memoirs years later, her portrait of her father was devastating, that of a coward incapable of protecting his own family. Meanwhile, the military situation of the Republic of Salo constantly deteriorated. The Allies advanced slowly but inexorably up the Italian peninsula. In June 1944, they took Rome. In the following months, the front line stabilised north of Florence, at the so-called Gothic Line, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before northern Italy also fell. The partisan resistance grew day by day. Tens of thousands of Italians had joined the brigades fighting in the mountains. Sabotage actions disrupted German communications and supplies. Partisans liberated entire villages, established provisional local governments, executed captured fascists. The Italian Civil War became increasingly bloody. The German and fascist reprisals were fierce. For every German soldier killed by the partisans, dozens of Italian civilians were executed. The massacres of Marzabotto, Sant'Anna di Stazzema, Boves, and many others left a trail of blood that Italy would take decades to forget. Mussolini signed the orders, authorized the operations, blessed the violence against his own people. In the autumn of 1944, Mussolini made one of his last major public appearances. On December 16th, he gave a speech at the Lirico Theatre in Milan before an audience of fascist militants. It was his attempt to recover some of the oratorical magic that had brought him to power 2 decades earlier. The speech mixed nostalgia, self-pity, and empty promises. Mussolini spoke of the origins of fascism, of past glories, of the betrayal he had suffered. He promised new weapons, imminent counter-offensives, a victory that was just around the corner. The audience applauded, but the enthusiasm was forced. Everyone in the room knew they were empty words. To what extent did Mussolini still believe in victory at such a late date? It's hard to know for sure. The testimonies of those around him suggest he alternated between moments of delusional optimism and periods of deep pessimism. Sometimes he spoke of the miracle weapons Germany was developing, of the V-2 rockets raining down on London, of the atomic bomb German scientists were supposedly about to complete. Other times he admitted that everything was lost, that all that remained was to sell the defeat dearly. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was the hardest of the war for Italy. Allied bombings continued. Fuel was scarce. Food was strictly rationed. In the cities, inhabitants froze in their homes because there was no coal for heating. And in the mountains, the partisans waited for the moment to launch the final insurrection. The Allied spring offensive began on April 9th, 1945. In little more than 2 weeks, the German and Italian defences collapsed. Bologna was liberated on April 21st. The German front disintegrated, with soldiers surrendering en masse or fleeing north. In the cities of northern Italy, the partisans rose up before the Allied forces arrived. Milan, Turin, Genoa liberated themselves in popular insurrections that swept away the remnants of fascist power. National liberation committees took control, disarming the fascists who had not fled, establishing a new provisional order. Where was Mussolini while his regime crumbled? Until the last moment, he clung to the illusion that he could negotiate, that he could find a way out. In mid-April, he tried to establish contact with the Allies through intermediaries, offering to surrender in exchange for personal guarantees. The Allies rejected any negotiation. On April 23rd, Mussolini left Lake Garda and moved to Milan, where he hoped to organise a last stand, or at least negotiate his surrender under favourable conditions. He settled in the city prefecture, surrounded by a small group of loyalists who still believed in him or simply had nowhere else to go. The following days were chaotic. Mussolini met with representatives of the National Liberation Committee, trying to negotiate an agreement that would allow him to survive. The negotiations led nowhere. The partisans demanded unconditional surrender and the handover of all fascist hierarchs to be judged. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini made the decision to flee. He left Milan at the head of a small column of vehicles, accompanied by a group of fascist hierarchs, German guards, and his mistress Clara Petacci. His plan was to reach Switzerland and seek asylum, or perhaps join a last redoubt of resistance in the Alps. The column advanced north, along the roads bordering Lake Como. But the partisans already controlled much of the territory. Checkpoints blocked the roads. Communications were cut. What was supposed to be a planned escape turned into a desperate flight. On April 27th, near the town of Dongo, Mussolini's column was stopped by partisans of the Garibaldi Brigade. The Germans travelling in the convoy negotiated their peaceful surrender, but the partisans demanded to inspect the vehicles in search of Italians, trying to escape disguised as Germans. Mussolini was found in a German truck, wrapped in a German military overcoat, pretending to be a sick soldier. The disguise attempt was pathetic. One of the partisans recognized him immediately. The founder of fascism, the dictator who had governed Italy for more than 2 decades, was now a prisoner of a group of communist guerrillas. What did Mussolini feel at that moment of capture? The sources are contradictory. Some testimonies claim he maintained his composure, that he even tried to identify himself with pride. Others suggest he was terrified, babbling incoherently, having lost all contact with reality. What we do know is that he offered no resistance, did not try to flee, and surrendered to his fate with surprising passivity. Clara Petacci was captured along with him. She had had the opportunity to escape. The partisans initially didn't know who she was and would have let her go. But she insisted on staying with Mussolini, a decision that would cost her life. The 2 prisoners were taken to a farmhouse in Giuliano di Mezzegra, where they spent their last night. The details of those final hours are confusing, contaminated by subsequent propaganda and the interest of the various groups that participated in the events. What is clear is that the National Liberation Committee of Northern Italy decided to execute Mussolini immediately, without a prior trial. The decision was controversial. Some wanted a public trial that would expose the crimes of fascism. Others feared that a long trial would give fascist sympathisers time to organise a rescue, or that the Allies would demand Mussolini be handed over to an international tribunal. The option of summary execution prevailed. On April 28, 1945, at 4:10 in the afternoon, a partisan named Walter Audicio, whose nom de guerre was Colonnello Valerio, arrived at the house where Mussolini and Petacci were held. He ordered them to follow him, supposedly to be moved to another location. He led them to a small road near the town of Giuliano di Mezzegra. There, in front of an iron gate, Audicio informed them that they had been sentenced to death by the Italian people. Mussolini, according to some testimonies, tried to protest, opened his overcoat and shouted, "Shoot me in the chest." According to others, he remained paralyzed, incapable of reacting. Clara Petacci supposedly tried to protect him with her body. Aldisio fired a burst from his submachine gun. Mussolini and Petacci fell dead. The execution had lasted barely a few seconds. Mussolini's body was loaded onto a truck, along with the corpses of Petacci and other fascist hierarchs captured in the same column. The convoy headed to Milan, where it arrived in the early hours of April 29th. What happened next was a scene that horrified the world and would become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. The corpses were taken to Piazzale Loreto, a square in northern Milan where 9 months earlier the fascists had executed 15 partisans and civilians in retaliation for an attack. The bodies of those victims had been left exposed for hours as a warning to the population. Now, in a macabre symmetry, the executioners would occupy the place of the victims. The corpses of Mussolini, Petacci, and 16 other fascist hierarchs were dumped on the ground of the square. A crowd began to gather. At first there were tens, then hundreds, finally thousands of people. What happened next was an explosion of collective fury accumulated during 2 decades of oppression. The people kicked the bodies, spat on them, beat them with sticks and stones. A woman fired 5 shots into Mussolini's corpse, one for each of her sons killed in the war. Others urinated on the remains. The photographs of that day show faces deformed by hatred, mouths open in screams, raised fists. It was as if all the rage contained during 20 years of dictatorship exploded simultaneously. What does this scene tell us about human nature? How can the same people who had cheered Mussolini at mass rallies now defile his corpse with such viciousness? The answer, perhaps, lies in the understanding that support for dictatorships is rarely genuine. It is the product of fear, of conformism, of the need to survive in a system that punishes dissent. When that fear disappears, when the system crumbles, the mask falls, and the true feelings that had been repressed for years emerge. To prevent the bodies from being completely destroyed by the crowd, the partisans decided to hang them upside down from the canopy of an abandoned gas station. The corpses of Mussolini, Petacci, and several others were suspended like macabre marionettes, their faces swollen and disfigured, their clothes torn. The photographs of this scene went around the world and became one of the most iconic images of the end of World War II in Europe. Why did they hang the bodies upside down? Explanations vary. Some maintain it was simply to protect them from the crowd, elevating them out of reach. Others argue it had a deliberate symbolic meaning. In medieval Italy, traitors were hung upside down as a special punishment. Whatever the reason, the resulting image perfectly captured the ignominious end of Italian fascism. Hitler received the news of Mussolini's death on April 30th, 1945, while locked in his Berlin bunker with Soviet troops just a few blocks away. According to some testimonies, the photographs of the corpses hanging in Piazzale Loreto impacted him profoundly. He did not want his body to suffer a similar fate. That same day, Hitler committed suicide alongside Eva Braun and ordered their bodies to be incinerated. Was Mussolini's death what finally convinced Hitler to take his own life? It's impossible to know for sure. The Führer had already been contemplating suicide for days, perhaps weeks. But the temporal coincidence is suggestive. The master followed the student into death with barely a 2-day difference, as if the fate of one was inextricably linked to that of the other. But the story of Mussolini's remains did not end at Piazzale Loreto. In fact, what happened to his corpse in the following years is a saga so extraordinary that it deserves to be told in detail. What happens when a dictator's body becomes a disputed political symbol? Can a corpse remain dangerous decades after death? After being exhibited for hours, the bodies of Mussolini and the other executed individuals were taken down and brought to the morgue of the Musocco cemetery in Milan. There, a forensic doctor performed an autopsy on the dictator's body. The report describes the multiple bullet wounds, the early state of decomposition, the damage caused by the crowd's blows. It was a clinical document, devoid of emotion, which reduced the once powerful Duce to a mere piece of medical evidence. Mussolini was buried in the Musocco cemetery in an unmarked grave, designated only by a number. The authorities hoped that anonymity would cause the site to fade into oblivion, that fascist nostalgics would not have a place of pilgrimage, but they underestimated the tenacity of those who still venerated his memory. In the early hours of April 23, 1946, almost exactly 1 year after Mussolini's death, a group of neo-fascists, led by Domenico Lecisi, desecrated the grave and stole the corpse. For over 3 months, the dictator's remains remained hidden, while the Italian police conducted a frantic search. The disappearance of the body became a national and international scandal. Where did they hide the corpse during those 100 days? The answer seems taken from a spy novel. The grave robbers moved it from one hiding place to another, always one step ahead of the police. At one point, the remains were hidden in a closet in a private house. Later, they were taken to a monastery near Pavia, where a Franciscan friar, sympathetic to fascism, agreed to keep them. Finally, in August 1946, the police recovered the corpse. Lecisi was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison, although he only served 2. But Italian authorities now faced a dilemma: what to do with the remains. Returning them to the public cemetery risked another desecration. Giving them to the family could create a fascist sanctuary. The solution was as strange as the problem. Mussolini's body was secretly handed over to the friars of the Capuchin convent in Terro Maggiore, near Milan, where it remained hidden for 11 years. For more than a decade, the remains of the founder of fascism were kept in a monastery closet, while his family was unaware of his whereabouts, and neo-fascists continued to venerate his memory without knowing where he was actually buried. This absurd situation finally ended in 1957, when Italian Prime Minister Oddone Zoli authorized the return of the remains to the Mussolini family. The body was given to his widow Rachele and buried in the family crypt at the San Cassiano cemetery in Predappio, the dictator's hometown. Since then, Mussolini's tomb in Predappio has become a place of pilgrimage for fascist nostalgics from all over Europe. Every year, especially on the anniversaries of his birth and death, thousands of people visit the site, many of them giving the fascist salute, wearing black shirts, carrying regime symbols. The Italian government has repeatedly debated what to do with this uncomfortable legacy, but so far has taken no definitive measures to prevent these manifestations. But let's go back in our narrative, because there are aspects of Mussolini's fall that we haven't fully explored. What role did the Italian resistance play in his overthrow? How did the partisans who finally captured and executed him organize? And above all, what legacy did fascism leave in Italy and the world? The Italian resistance against the German occupation and the Republic of Salo was one of the most important partisan movements in Western Europe during World War II. Unlike the French resistance, which has been widely mythologized, the Italian resistance has received less international attention, perhaps because Italy's history during the war is more complicated, more uncomfortable, less susceptible to heroic simplifications. The first resistance groups emerged immediately after the armistice on September 8, 1943. Italian soldiers who refused to surrender to the Germans, civilians who helped escape Allied prisoners of war, anti-fascist militants who had waited years for this moment. Gradually, these dispersed groups organized into coordinated brigades. The political composition of the resistance was diverse: communists, socialists, liberals, Catholics, monarchists. They had very different visions of what kind of Italy should emerge after the war. But during the conflict, these differences were subordinated to the common goal of liberating the country from German occupation and fascism. The conditions under which the partisans operated were extremely difficult. They lived in the mountains, in makeshift shelters, with a constant shortage of food, weapons, and medicine. The winter was particularly brutal in the Apennines and the Italian Alps. Many died not in combat, but from cold, disease, or malnutrition. German and fascist reprisals were ruthless. For every German soldier killed, 10, 20, sometimes 50 Italian civilians were executed. The SS and the troops of the Republic of Salo razed entire villages suspected of collaborating with the partisans. The massacres of Marzabotto, where over 700 people died, and Sant' di Stazzema, with over 500 victims, are only the most well-known of hundreds of similar atrocities. Why did people continue to join the resistance despite these terrible risks? The motivations were varied. Some acted out of political conviction, out of hatred for the fascism they had endured for 2 decades. Others sought revenge for dead or deported relatives. Many simply wanted to avoid being forcibly drafted to work in German factories or serve in the army of the Republic of Salo. And there were those who, seeing that German defeat was inevitable, decided to side with the victors before it was too late. By April 1945, it is estimated there were between 200,000 and 300,000 active partisans in northern Italy. When German forces began to collapse, these groups launched coordinated uprisings in all major cities. Milan, Turin, Genoa, Bologna liberated themselves before Allied troops arrived. This capacity for self-organization and collective action would be fundamental for the reconstruction of Italian democracy after the war. Mussolini's execution by the partisans must be understood in this context. It was not an act of irrational barbarism, but a calculated political decision made by the National Liberation Committee of Northern Italy. Partisan leaders feared that if Mussolini was captured alive by the Allies, he would be tried in an international tribunal that could take years, that might allow him to use the stand as a propaganda platform, that could end in a relatively light sentence. The immediate execution closed that chapter definitively. But the way the execution was carried out, and especially the subsequent treatment of the corpses, generated controversy even among those who celebrated the dictator's death. Some resistance leaders, particularly those of Catholic and liberal orientation, considered the display of bodies in Piazzale Loreto an unnecessary degradation that lowered the victors to the moral level of the vanquished. Others argued it was exactly what fascism deserved, a symmetrical response to the atrocities the regime had committed. This debate over how to treat the defeated reflected deeper tensions over what kind of justice was appropriate after fascism. Should Italy carry out an exhaustive purge of everyone who had collaborated with the regime? Or was national reconciliation preferable to allow the country to move forward without getting trapped in the past? In practice, the Italian purge was relatively limited. Thousands of fascists were arrested in the days and weeks following liberation, but most were gradually released. Trials were few and sentences generally light. By the 1950s, former fascists held important positions in the government, public administration, the judicial system, and security forces. Why did this happen? The reasons are multiple. The Cold War caused Western allies, especially the United States, to prioritize anti-communist stability over anti-fascist justice. Italian conservative parties, including the Christian democracy that would dominate Italian politics for decades, preferred to integrate former fascists rather than leave them as a radicalized opposition force. And many ordinary Italians simply wanted to forget the past and rebuild their lives. The result was what historians have called Italy's divided memory. For the Italian left, the resistance and liberation were the founding moments of the Republic, the source of its democratic legitimacy. For the right, especially the nostalgic right, it was a civil war in which the victors had committed atrocities, comparable to those of the vanquished. This division was never completely resolved and continues to influence Italian politics to this day. But let's return to the personal level, to the individual lives affected by Mussolini's fall. What happened to his family, his closest collaborators, those who had tied their fate to his? Rachele Mussolini, the dictator's wife, survived the war. She had tried to flee to Switzerland with her husband, but was captured by partisans near the border. However, unlike Clara Petacci, she was not executed. Perhaps the partisans considered that as a wife she had a different status than the mistress. Or perhaps they simply didn't want to kill a woman who had not directly participated in the regime's crimes. Rachele lived the rest of her life in Italy, mainly in Predappio, where she died in 1979 at the age of 89. She wrote memoirs defending her husband, maintained until the end that he had been a great leader betrayed by his collaborators, and never accepted Mussolini's responsibility for the disasters he had caused. Mussolini's children had varied destinies. Edda, the eldest daughter who never forgave her father for allowing the execution of her husband, Ciano, lived in Switzerland for years after the war. She eventually returned to Italy, where she died in 1995. Her memoirs, published posthumously, offer a devastating portrait of her father and of fascism. Vittorio, the eldest son, had been an Air Force pilot and had participated in the Ethiopian War. After the war, he emigrated to Argentina, where he lived for years under a false name. He eventually returned to Italy, dedicated himself to writing screenplays, and died in 1997. Bruno, another son, had died during the war in 1941, when the plane he was piloting crashed during a test flight. His death had profoundly affected Mussolini, who supposedly never fully recovered from the loss. Romano, the youngest son, became a jazz musician after the war, a surprising career choice given that fascism had despised jazz as degenerate music. He died in 2006. His daughter, Alessandra Mussolini, entered politics and has been a member of the Italian Parliament and the European Parliament, defending right-wing positions although partially distancing herself from her grandfather's legacy. What does this family saga tell us about how societies process the legacies of dictatorship? The descendants of dictators face an impossible dilemma. Completely renouncing their ancestors' legacy means denying part of their own identity. Defending it makes them accomplices to crimes they did not commit. The Mussolini family has oscillated between these extremes for decades. Now let's examine the ideological legacy of Italian fascism. What remained of the doctrine that Mussolini had created and that Hitler had adapted for Germany? Did fascism die with its founder, or does it survive in some form to this day? Fascism as an organized political movement effectively died with the Republic of Salo. The Italian Constitution of 1948 explicitly prohibited the reconstitution of the Fascist Party, and subsequent laws criminalized the apology of fascism and the use of fascist symbols. These legal restrictions, combined with the total discredit of the regime, prevented the rise of a massive neo-fascist movement in post-war Italy. However, nostalgic currents never completely disappeared. The Movimento Sociale Italiano, founded in 1946, gathered former fascists and functioned as a marginal but persistent opposition party for decades. In the 1990s, this party transformed into Alleanza Nazionale, formally abandoning the fascist heritage and adopting a conventional conservative position. More recently, parties like Fratelli d'Italia, heir to that tradition, have reached government positions. Does this mean that fascism has returned to Italy? The answer is complex. Current Italian right-wing parties are not fascist in the classical sense. They accept electoral democracy, do not propose single-party dictatorships, do not have paramilitary militias. But certain elements of fascist discourse, aggressive nationalism, hostility toward immigrants, nostalgia for a glorious past, contempt for intellectual elites, reappear periodically in Italian and European political debate. The international legacy of fascism is equally ambiguous. Mussolini was the first to demonstrate that an extremist movement could reach power in a European democracy using a combination of street violence, effective propaganda, and the complicity of traditional elites. This model was copied not only by Hitler, but by numerous authoritarian movements around the world throughout the 20th century. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Italian fascism is not in its specific doctrines, which were contradictory and opportunistic, but in the political style it inaugurated. Politics as spectacle, the charismatic leader who embodies the nation, the permanent mobilization of the masses, the contempt for rational deliberation, the glorification of action over thought. These fascist elements have been adopted, in more or less attenuated versions, by political movements of all ideological orientations. Could the fascist experience be repeated in today's world? This is perhaps the most important question we can ask ourselves when studying the fall of Mussolini. Historians and political scientists debate this issue intensely. Some argue that the specific conditions that allowed the rise of fascism, the devastation of World War I, the economic crisis, the weakness of democratic institutions, will not be reproduced in the same way. Others warn that new forms of authoritarianism, adapted to the technologies and circumstances of the 21st century, represent comparable threats. What we can state with certainty is that the study of how Mussolini came to power, how he exercised it, and how he lost it, remains relevant for any citizen concerned about the health of democracy. The warning signs that preceded fascism, the normalization of political violence, the contempt for institutions, the demonization of adversaries, the subordination of truth to political convenience, are recognizable in many contemporary contexts. Now let's delve into an aspect we have mentioned briefly but deserves more attention: the relationship between Mussolini and the Catholic Church. How could an initially anti-clerical regime end up signing a concordat with the Vatican? What role did the Church play in the rise and fall of fascism? In his younger years, Mussolini had been virulently anti-clerical. He wrote articles attacking the Church, boasted of his atheism, described Christianity as a religion of slaves. But when he reached power, he understood that a confrontation with the Catholic Church in an overwhelmingly Catholic country like Italy would be politically suicidal. On the 11th of February, 1929, the fascist government and the Holy See signed the Lateran Pacts, which resolved the Roman question that had poisoned relations between the Italian state and the Church since the unification of Italy in 1870. The agreements recognized the Vatican as an independent state, established Catholicism as the religion of the Italian state, and guaranteed religious instruction in public schools. In exchange, the Church finally recognized the Kingdom of Italy with Rome as its capital. For Mussolini, the Lateran Pacts were an enormous propaganda triumph. He had achieved what no previous Italian government had managed: reconciliation with the Pope. Italian Catholics, who had previously viewed fascism with suspicion, could now support it without a conflict of conscience. Mussolini's international prestige increased significantly, but the relationship between fascism and the Church was never entirely harmonious. Pope Pius XI, who had signed the Lateran Pacts, also published in 1931 the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno, which harshly criticized the totalitarian pretensions of the fascist regime, especially its attempt to monopolize the education of the youth. Catholic youth organizations repeatedly clashed with fascist youth organizations. When Mussolini, pressured by Hitler, introduced anti-Semitic racial laws in 1938, the Church expressed some opposition, although more for doctrinal than humanitarian reasons. The laws affected Jews converted to Catholicism, whose membership in the Church was denied by racial classification. Pope Pius XI was preparing a more direct encyclical against racism and anti-Semitism when he died in February 1939. His successor, Pius XII, did not publish it. The role of Pius XII during World War II and the Holocaust remains intensely debated. The Pope never publicly condemned the extermination of European Jews, even though the Vatican had detailed information about what was happening. Some defend that his silence was a calculated strategy to protect Catholics under Nazi occupation and facilitate discreet rescue efforts. Others accuse him of moral cowardice or even covert sympathy with fascism. The debate continues decades later. What is documented is that during the German occupation of Rome, convents, monasteries, and Catholic institutions hid thousands of Jews, politically persecuted individuals, and escaped prisoners of war. These rescue efforts saved many lives. although it is impossible to know if a more direct papal condemnation would have had any effect on Nazi policies. After the fall of Mussolini, the Italian church rapidly distanced itself from the regime it had supported for 2 decades. Bishops who had blessed fascist flags now celebrated liberation. Parishes that had organised collections for the Ethiopian war now assisted refugees and displaced persons. The transition was astonishingly smooth, as if the marriage between Catholicism and fascism had never existed. This capacity for institutional adaptation partly explains why the Italian Catholic Church maintained its influence after the war, while fascism sank into disrepute. Christian Democracy, the party that would dominate Italian politics until the 1990s, was essentially the political arm of Italian Catholicism. Christian values replaced fascist values as the ideological foundation of Italian conservatism, allowing for social and economic continuity under a facade of political rupture. But let's return to Mussolini's last days to examine some details we haven't fully explored yet. What did the dictator attempt to do in his final hours? Was there any escape plan that almost worked? What documents was he carrying when he was captured? And what did they reveal about his intentions? When Mussolini left Milan on the 25th of April, 1945, he carried with him 2 briefcases full of documents. The contents of these briefcases have been the subject of speculation for decades. Some historians believe they contained compromising correspondence with Allied leaders, perhaps even with Winston Churchill, which would have documented secret contacts between the British government and the fascist regime before the war. Others suggest they were financial documents, revealing where the supposed fascist treasure was hidden. After Mussolini's execution, the briefcases disappeared. Their fate has never been definitively clarified. Some testimonies claim they were handed over to Allied intelligence services. Others maintain that the partisans destroyed or sold them. There are those who believe that certain documents were discreetly returned to the British government in exchange for silence about their contents. This uncertainty has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. Did Churchill-Mussolini correspondence really exist that proved British willingness to reach agreements with fascism? Were the British the ones who ordered Mussolini's execution to prevent these documents from coming to light? There is no solid evidence backing these theories, but the lack of definitive documentation about the briefcases allows speculation to continue. What we do know is that Mussolini had vague plans to establish a final redoubt of resistance in the Alps, near the Swiss border. This idea of an Alpine redoubt, a mountainous bastion where Axis forces would resist indefinitely, also circulated in Nazi circles. Hitler had spoken of retreating to the Bavarian Alps. Some fascist hierarchs imagined doing the same in the Italian Alps. These plans were fantasies with no basis in reality. The infrastructure, supplies, and troops necessary to sustain prolonged resistance in the mountains did not exist. But they reveal the mental state of the fascist leaders in their final days, unable to accept defeat, clinging to illusions, denying the evidence right before their eyes. There were also last-minute negotiation attempts. In the days prior to his capture, Mussolini met with representatives of the National Liberation Committee at the Archiepiscopal Palace of Milan. Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster acted as an intermediary. The partisans demanded unconditional surrender and the handover of all fascist hierarchs. Mussolini tried to negotiate security guarantees for himself and his collaborators. The conversations failed. There is a revealing detail about this failed negotiation. During the meeting, Mussolini discovered that the Germans were separately negotiating their own surrender without consulting or including him. The dictator felt betrayed, abandoned by the allies he had served for years. In a way, he was experiencing what Italy had felt when he dragged it into a disastrous alliance. The junior partner always ends up discarded when no longer useful. Did Mussolini consider suicide during those final days? Testimonies are contradictory. Some of his collaborators state he spoke of taking his own life before falling into partisan hands. Others maintain he was determined to escape to Switzerland and continue the fight from exile. Clara Petacci supposedly begged him to flee together to Spain or Argentina, but all these plans required crossing partisan lines, travelling through enemy-controlled territory, something that ultimately proved impossible. The vehicle column transporting Mussolini north included not only fascist hierarchs, but also a German escort. The Germans hoped to negotiate their surrender to the Anglo-American allies and avoid falling into partisan hands. When the column was stopped in Dongo, the Germans peacefully surrendered their weapons in exchange for safe conduct. It is at this moment that the scene sealing Mussolini's fate occurs. The partisans insisted on inspecting the German vehicles to ensure no Italians were hiding. Mussolini was in a truck, wrapped in a German military overcoat, wearing a helmet that partially hid his face. He pretended to be a sick German soldier, too weak to speak. The partisan who identified him was Luigi Cottoni, a communist who had spent years in fascist prisons. He recognized the dictator despite the disguise, perhaps by his characteristic chin, perhaps by the way he moved, perhaps simply because he had memorized his face during the years of clandestinity when he dreamed of this moment. The capture was anticlimactic. Mussolini offered no resistance, did not try to flee, did not draw any of the weapons he supposedly carried. According to some testimonies, he simply said, "Don't hurt me," when identified. The founder of fascism, the man who had glorified violence, who had sent millions to war, who had built his career on the image of virility and bravery, surrendered like a lamb. What does this final capitulation tell us about Mussolini's true character? Psychologists and historians have debated this question extensively. Some suggest the fascist bravado had always been a mask, hiding profound insecurities. Others argue that after years of illness, stress, and defeats, Mussolini was simply exhausted, incapable of the slightest resistance. It's also possible he hoped to negotiate, believing his value as a prisoner would protect him. But psychological speculation can only take us so far. What matters historically is the brutal contrast between fascist rhetoric of heroism and sacrifice, and the reality of a dictator captured while trying to flee in disguise. This contrast destroyed any possibility of Italian fascism surviving as a heroic myth. There was no Wagnerian Gotterdammerung. There was no glorious final battle, just a sick old man hiding in a German truck. Now let's consider the broader international context in which Mussolini's fall occurred. How did the Allies react to his death? What role did the United States and Great Britain play in the events leading to his execution? And how was the news received in Nazi Germany, which was living its own final days? Winston Churchill received the news of Mussolini's death with mixed emotions. The British Prime Minister had a complicated history with the Italian dictator. In the 20s and 30s, Churchill had expressed admiration for Mussolini, praising him as a bulwark against communism. Even after Italy entered the war against Great Britain, Churchill maintained a certain personal respect for his adversary. But Churchill's admiration was mixed with contempt for Italian military incompetence. In his war memoirs, Churchill repeatedly ridicules Mussolini's imperial pretensions, contrasting the grandiloquence of his speeches with the mediocrity of his achievements. The dictator's violent death confirmed Churchill's judgment. Fascism was fundamentally fraudulent, a facade of power that crumbled at the first contact with reality. Franklin D. Roosevelt had died barely 2 weeks before Mussolini, on the 12th of April, 1945. His successor, Harry Truman, was still familiarizing himself with the details of the war when the news of the Italian dictator's death arrived. The official American reaction was sober. Mussolini had been an enemy of democracy. His death closed a dark chapter of European history. There were no official celebrations, but no laments either. In the Soviet Union, the news was received with ideological satisfaction. Stalin had despised Italian fascism, considering it a particularly corrupt and incompetent form of capitalism. Mussolini's execution by Italian communist partisans confirmed the Soviet narrative that the working people would eventually rise up against their oppressors. In Nazi Germany, the news arrived in a moment of absolute chaos. Soviet troops were in the suburbs of Berlin. Hitler was locked in his bunker, alternating between outbursts of fury and periods of apathy. The Nazi high command was busy trying to flee west, toward Allied lines, hoping to surrender to the Anglo-Americans before falling into Soviet hands. As mentioned earlier, Hitler supposedly saw photographs of Mussolini's corpse hanging in Piazzale Loreto. According to some testimonies, he swore he would never let his body suffer a similar fate. This supposedly influenced his decision to order the cremation of his remains after his suicide. But beyond the individual reactions of leaders, Mussolini's death symbolized something broader: the definitive collapse of fascism as a political force in Europe. The movement that had promised a new order, a superior civilization, a 1,000-year empire, ended in an abandoned gas station, with its founder hanging upside down like a carcass in a slaughterhouse. This image of Piazzale Loreto would become a warning for future dictators. No matter how powerful you appear, no matter how many multitudes cheer you, no matter how many enemies you crush, in the end, you can end up hanging from a meat hook, while the people who pretended to adore you spit on your corpse. It is a brutal lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. Now let's explore a topic we've touched on briefly, but deserves more in-depth analysis: the differences and similarities between Mussolini and Hitler, and how these influenced the fate of their respective regimes. Mussolini and Hitler shared many characteristics. Both were charismatic demagogues, with a talent for mass oratory. Both had emerged from the margins of society, resentful of the elites who had despised them. Both believed in the supremacy of will over reason, of action over deliberation. Both built personality cults that presented them as almost divine figures. But there were also significant differences. Mussolini was fundamentally an opportunist, with no deep convictions beyond his own self-aggrandizement. Italian fascism was ideologically confused, capable of incorporating elements from left and right as convenient. Hitler, on the other hand, had a structured worldview. However grotesque it might be: racial anti-Semitism, the theory of living space, the hierarchy of races. Nazism was ideologically more coherent, which also made it more dangerous. Mussolini ruled Italy for 21 years. Hitler ruled Germany for 12. But the impact of Nazism was infinitely more devastating. The Holocaust, with its 6 million Jewish victims and millions of other persecuted groups, has no equivalent in fascist Italy. Italian racial laws were odious, but Italy did not build extermination camps. The deportations of Italian Jews only began after the German occupation. Why this difference? The explanations are multiple. Anti-Semitism did not have the deep roots in Italy that it had in German and Central European culture. The Catholic Church, even if it remained silent on the Holocaust, represented a moral break that didn't exist in secularized Protestant Germany. And simply put, Mussolini did not share Hitler's genocidal obsession. His brutality was more instrumental than ideological. But it would be a mistake to minimize the crimes of Italian fascism. The atrocities committed in Ethiopia, including the use of chemical weapons against civilians, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. Repression in Libya was equally brutal. In the Balkans, Italian troops participated in massacres and war crimes. The complicity of the Republic of Salo with Nazi deportations makes it complicit in the Holocaust. Italian fascism was not a benign version of totalitarianism. It was simply less efficient in its cruelty. The personal relationship between Mussolini and Hitler evolved significantly over the years. In the 20s and early 30s, Mussolini was clearly the dominant partner. Hitler sent admiring letters, sought advice, imitated the techniques of Italian fascism. But after 1933, and especially after 1938, the positions reversed. There is a moment that perfectly captures this reversal. In March 1938, when Hitler annexed Austria, Mussolini did not protest, even though 4 years earlier he had mobilized troops on the Austrian border to prevent a similar attempt. Hitler was so grateful he supposedly told Mussolini he would never forget his support. But what this episode really proved was that Mussolini no longer had the power to oppose Hitler, even if he wanted to. From that moment on, the relationship grew increasingly asymmetric. Mussolini followed Hitler's policies, introduced the racial laws Hitler demanded, entered wars Hitler initiated. The proud Duce had become a subordinate. This degradation was evident to everyone except, apparently, to Mussolini himself, who kept talking as if he were the leader of a great power. Mussolini's rescue by German commandos in September 1943 was the definitive symbol of this subordination. The man who had inspired Hitler now depended on Hitler, even for his physical survival. The Republic of Salo was a German creation, governed by a dictator who was essentially a prisoner of his supposed allies. In his final months, Mussolini seems to have understood the magnitude of his mistake in allying with Hitler. In private conversations, he expressed resentment toward the Germans, criticized their arrogance, complained about being treated like a subordinate. But these complaints came too late. He had tied his fate to Germany's, and he couldn't untie it. Could Mussolini have taken a different path? This is one of the great counterfactual questions of 20th century history. If he had maintained Italian neutrality in World War II, if he had resisted Hitler's pressures, if he had sought an agreement with the Western Allies, would Italian fascism have survived? Some historians argue that Italian fascism was doomed regardless of Mussolini's decisions during the war. The regime was plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and internal contradictions that would eventually have destroyed it. The war simply accelerated an inevitable collapse. Others suggest that a more prudent Mussolini could have navigated the war like Franco in Spain, remaining nominally neutral, flirting with both sides, waiting to see who won. If he had followed this strategy, perhaps he would have ended his days as an aging dictator in an impoverished but not destroyed Italy, similar to Francoist Spain in the 60s. But these speculations ignore the fundamental nature of fascism. Mussolini's regime depended on permanent mobilization, on a constant sense of crisis, on the promise of national glory. A fascism that sat on the sidelines while Europe burned would have lost its reason for being. War was not an accident of fascism, it was its logical destiny. Now let us bring our narrative to its conclusion, examining the lessons we can extract from Mussolini's fall for our understanding of authoritarian regimes in general. The first lesson is about the fragility of dictatorial power. Mussolini seemed invincible for years. He controlled the state, the party, the media, the armed forces. Mass rallies in Piazza Venezia showed a people seemingly united behind their leader. But this power was illusory. The moment the king withdrew his support, the edifice collapsed like a house of cards. Dictators depend on the complicity of elites and the acquiescence of the masses. When elites decide the dictator no longer serves their interests, they abandon him. When the masses lose their fear, they discover the emperor was naked all along. This pattern has repeated itself countless times in history, from the fall of Greek tyrants to the collapses of Latin American dictatorships in the 20th century. The second lesson is about the dangers of vanity in political leadership. Mussolini made catastrophic decisions driven not by strategic analysis, but by his need to look important, to be center stage, to compete with Hitler. His entry into World War II was motivated by the desire to sit at the peace table, not by genuine Italian national interests. His invasion of Greece was an attempt to prove he could achieve independent victories. Each of these decisions worsened Italy's situation. Leaders who put their ego before the interest of their countries invariably end up causing disasters. This is not exclusive to dictators. It also happens in democracies when voters elect narcissistic demagogues. Vanity is perhaps the most dangerous flaw in a political leader. The third lesson is about the nature of alliances between authoritarian regimes. Mussolini imagined his alliance with Hitler would make him the master of the Mediterranean, the leader of a renewed empire. Instead, he ended up as a subordinate, exploited when useful, discarded when he ceased to be. Dictatorships do not form genuine alliances, because their leaders are fundamentally incapable of trusting anyone. Each partner seeks to exploit the other. The stronger inevitably dominates the weaker. The fourth lesson is about historical memory and transitional justice. Italy never adequately processed the legacy of fascism. The purge was limited. War criminals were not judged. Society chose oblivion rather than confronting its past. The result has been a divided memory that continues to poison Italian politics 80 years later. Other countries have taken different paths. Germany undertook a profound confrontation with its Nazi past, although the process took decades and remains incomplete. Spain, under Franco, opted for a silence similar to Italy's, and only recently has begun to address the crimes of the Civil War and the dictatorship. Every society must find its own balance between justice and reconciliation, but ignoring the past rarely works. The fifth lesson, perhaps the most important, is about citizen responsibility in democracies. Fascism did not reach power by a military coup or a foreign invasion. It arrived because enough Italians supported or tolerated it, because elites believed they could use it for their own ends, because the opposition was divided and indecisive. Italian democracy died not with a bang, but with a whimper, surrendered by those who should have defended it. This means that the survival of democracy depends on ordinary citizens. We cannot delegate the defense of our liberties to politicians, judges, or generals. When we see signs of emerging authoritarianism, when demagogues attack institutions, when political violence is normalized, the time to act is before it's too late, not after. Mussolini ended up hanging upside down in an abandoned gas station because he made disastrous decisions for decades. But he also ended up that way because millions of Italians allowed him to reach power and stay in it for 20 years. The responsibility for fascism is not Mussolini's alone. It belongs to all those who made it possible. When we contemplate the photographs of Piazzale Loreto, with mutilated bodies swinging in the air, we must remember that this macabre scene was the result of choices made by ordinary people over 2 decades. The crowd kicking Mussolini's corpse included many who had cheered him years before. The horror of that moment was partly the horror of recognition. This is what we allowed to happen. This is where we ended up. The fate of Benito Mussolini is a warning inscribed on the body of history. It reminds us that empires built on lies crumble, that grandiloquent promises end in ruin, that leaders who glorify violence often die violently. The fascists had executed 15 partisans and civilians in retaliation for an attack. The bodies of those victims had been left exposed for hours as a warning to the population. Now, in a macabre symmetry, the executioners would occupy the place of the victims. Do you remember the phrase Mussolini supposedly uttered when he learned of that massacre in August 1944? According to testimonies, he said, "We will pay dearly for the blood of Piazzale Loreto." 8 months later, his words became prophecy. The corpses of Mussolini, Petacci, and more than a dozen fascist hierarchs were dumped on the square's ground during the early hours of April 29th. When dawn broke, a crowd began to gather. At first there were tens, then hundreds, finally thousands of people. What happened next was an explosion of collective fury accumulated over 2 decades of oppression that no witness could ever forget. The people kicked the bodies, spat on them, beat them with sticks and stones. A woman pushed her way through the crowd, pulled out a pistol, and fired 5 shots into Mussolini's corpse. When asked why she did it, she replied, "For my 5 dead sons." Others urinated on the remains. Some used hammers to disfigure the faces. The photographs of that day show faces deformed by hatred, mouths open in screams, raised fists. It was as if all the rage contained during 20 years of dictatorship exploded simultaneously in one single place. What does this scene tell us about human nature? How can the same people who had cheered Mussolini at mass rallies, who had chanted Duce, Duce with almost religious fervour, now defile his corpse with such viciousness? The answer, perhaps, lies in the understanding that support for dictatorships is rarely genuine. It is the product of fear, of conformism, of the need to survive in a system that punishes dissent. When that fear disappears, when the system crumbles, the mask falls, and the true feelings that had been repressed for years emerge. To prevent the bodies from being completely destroyed by the enraged crowd, the partisans decided to hang them upside down from the canopy of an abandoned Esso gas station. The corpses of Mussolini, Petacci, and several others were suspended like macabre marionettes, their faces swollen and disfigured, their clothes torn. The photographs of this scene went around the world and became one of the most iconic images of the end of World War II in Europe. Why did they hang the bodies upside down? Explanations vary. Some maintain it was simply to protect them from the crowd, elevating them out of reach. Others argue it had a deliberate symbolic meaning. In medieval Italy, traitors were hung upside down as a special punishment. Whatever the reason, the resulting image perfectly captured the ignominious end of Italian fascism. But here a question arises that few dare to formulate. Was this macabre exhibition an act of popular justice, or simply another form of barbarism? Can the victim turn into an executioner without staining their hands? This moral dilemma would haunt Italy for decades. Adolf Hitler received the news of Mussolini's death on April 30th, 1945, while locked in his Berlin bunker with Soviet troops just a few blocks away. According to multiple testimonies, the photographs of the corpses hanging in Piazzale Loreto impacted him profoundly. He did not want his body to suffer a similar fate. That same day, Hitler committed suicide alongside Eva Braun and ordered their bodies to be incinerated. Was Mussolini's death what finally convinced the Hitler to take his own life? It's impossible to know for sure. The Führer had already been contemplating suicide for days, perhaps weeks, but the temporal coincidence is extraordinarily suggestive. The student followed the master into death with barely a 2-day difference, as if the fate of one was inextricably linked to that of the other. The week of April 28th to May 2nd, 1945, was, as someone later wrote, a good week for anti-fascism. But the story of Mussolini's remains did not end at Piazzale Loreto. In fact, what happened to his corpse in the following years is a saga so extraordinary, so full of unexpected twists, that it deserves to be told in detail. What happens when a dictator's body becomes a disputed political symbol? Can a corpse remain dangerous decades after death? The answer will surprise you. After being exhibited for hours, the bodies of Mussolini and the other executed individuals were taken down and brought to the morgue of the Musocco cemetery in Milan. There, a forensic doctor performed an autopsy on the dictator's body. The report describes the multiple bullet wounds, the early state of decomposition, the damage caused by the crowd's blows. It was a clinical document, devoid of emotion, which reduced the once powerful Duce to a mere piece of medical evidence. Mussolini was buried in the Musocco cemetery in an unmarked grave, designated only by a number. The authorities hoped that anonymity would cause the site to fade into oblivion, that fascist nostalgics would not find a place of pilgrimage. But they severely underestimated the tenacity of those who still venerated his memory. And this is where our story takes a turn that seems taken from a mystery novel. What happens when a group of fanatics decides to steal the corpse of a dictator? How far can ideological obsession go? In the early hours of April 23rd, 1946, almost exactly 1 year after Mussolini's death, a group of neo-fascists, led by Domenico Lecisi, desecrated the grave and stole the corpse. For over 3 months, the dictator's remains remained hidden, while the Italian police conducted a frantic search across the whole country. The disappearance of the body became a national and international scandal that grabbed newspaper headlines for weeks. Where did they hide the corpse during those 100 days? The answer seems taken from a spy movie. The grave robbers moved it from one hiding place to another, always one step ahead of the police. At one point, the remains were hidden in a closet in a private house. Later, they were taken to a monastery near Pavia, where a Franciscan friar, sympathetic to fascism, agreed to keep them. The corpse of the founder of European fascism, Hitler's ally, the dictator who had dragged Italy into war, was hidden among cassocks and crucifixes. Finally, in August 1946, the police recovered the corpse. Lecce was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison, although he only served 2. But Italian authorities now faced a dilemma no one had anticipated: what to do with the remains. Returning them to the public cemetery risked another desecration. Giving them to the family could create a fascist sanctuary. Destroying them would raise accusations of barbarism. Every option was politically problematic. The solution they found was as strange as the problem itself. Mussolini's body was secretly handed over to the friars of the Capuchin convent in Cerro Maggiore, near Milan, where it remained hidden for 11 years. For over a decade, the remains of the founder of fascism were kept in a monastery closet, while his family was unaware of his whereabouts, and neo-fascists continued to venerate his memory, without knowing where he was actually buried. Can you imagine the irony of this situation? The leader who had used the Catholic Church to legitimize himself, who had signed the Lateran Pacts with the Vatican, who had proclaimed that fascism would restore the greatness of Rome, ended up kept as a shameful secret in a convent closet. History sometimes writes its own satires. This absurd situation finally ended in 1957, when Italian Prime Minister Oddone Zoli authorized the return of the remains to the Mussolini family. The decision was political. Zoli sought the support of right-wing deputies in parliament, and this gesture towards fascist nostalgics was his way of securing it. Electoral pragmatism triumphed over anti-fascist principles. The body was given to his widow, Rachele, and buried in the family crypt at the San Cassiano Cemetery in Predappio, the dictator's hometown. The circle was closed. Mussolini had been born in Predappio in 1883, and now, more than 7 decades later, he returned forever to the land that saw his birth. But what happened next raises uncomfortable questions that Italy still hasn't answered satisfactorily. What happens when a tyrant's tomb becomes a place of pilgrimage? Should a democracy tolerate the veneration of those who tried to destroy it? Since then, Mussolini's tomb in Predappio has become a pilgrimage site for fascist nostalgics from all over Europe. Every year, especially on the anniversaries of his birth on July 29th and his death on April 28th, hundreds of people visit the place. Many of them give the fascist salute, wear black shirts, carry regime symbols. It is, according to dark tourism experts, one of the most controversial sites on the continent, with a rating of 9 out of 10 on the disturbance scale. The crypt itself is a space designed to impress. When you descend the stairs to the underground level, you first encounter the tombs of other members of the Mussolini family. But Benito's sarcophagus occupies the central spot, illuminated by white neon lights that create an almost religious atmosphere. In front of his tomb is an altar covered with the Italian tricolour flag and a guest book where pilgrims leave their messages. A massive white marble bust dominates the space, showing the dictator with an expression of fierce determination in typical fascist masculine style. The tomb is protected by a metal bar decorated with flower wreaths, some strange offerings like soccer team scarves, and symbols evoking the era of the regime. What do visitors write in the signature book? According to those who have documented the site, the messages range from sentimental nostalgia to open apology for fascism. There are those who express admiration, those who ask for forgiveness for how he ended, those who promise the spirit of the Duce will live forever. It is, in the words of one visitor, creepy to a truly terrifying degree. Local authorities have tried to control this situation with mixed results. A few years ago, they banned the sale of fascist souvenirs, in the vicinity of the cemetery, but they cannot prevent people from visiting a tomb in a public cemetery, nor can they control what visitors do or say once inside the crypt. The contrast with how Germany has handled Hitler's remains is revealing. No tomb of Hitler exists precisely to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site. Authorities in Berlin even refused to mark the site of the bunker where he died, fearful of turning it into a tourist attraction. But Italy took a different path and now lives with the consequences of that decision. Another comparable case is that of Francisco Franco in Spain, whose body was housed for decades in the gigantic Valley of the Fallen complex. However, the Spanish government finally decided to exhume the dictator's remains in 2019 and move them to a more discreet family cemetery, precisely to end the cult that had formed around his tomb. Italy has not taken that step with Mussolini. But let's return now to the final days of the fascist regime to examine details we haven't yet fully explored. What documents was Mussolini carrying when he was captured? Were there secrets that never came to light? Why were so many powerful people interested in silencing him permanently? When Mussolini left Milan on the 25th of April, 1945, he carried with him 2 briefcases full of documents. The contents of these briefcases have been the subject of speculation for decades. Some historians believe they contained compromising correspondence with Allied leaders, perhaps even with Winston Churchill, which would have documented secret contacts between the British government and the fascist regime before the war. Others suggest they were financial documents revealing where the supposed fascist treasure was hidden. Gold and jewels accumulated during 2 decades of corruption. After Mussolini's execution, the briefcases disappeared. Their fate has never been definitively clarified. Some testimonies claim they were handed over to Allied intelligence services. Others maintain that the partisans destroyed or sold them. There are those who believe that certain documents were discreetly returned to the British government in exchange for silence regarding their contents. This uncertainty has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. Did Churchill-Mussolini correspondence really exist that proved British willingness to reach agreements with fascism? Were the British the ones who ordered Mussolini's execution to prevent these documents from coming to light? There is no solid evidence backing these theories, but the lack of definitive documentation about the briefcases allows speculation to continue to our days. Now let's examine closer the trajectory that led Mussolini from the heights of power to the Piazzale Loreto gas station. How was it possible that the architect of fascism, the leader who had inspired Hitler, ended up disguised as a German soldier trying to flee like a common fugitive? The answer begins with the military disasters that eroded the regime's credibility. Let's remember, in 1940, Mussolini sent 130,000 soldiers under the command of Marshal Rodolfo Graziani to invade Egypt from Libya. After advancing barely 80 kilometers, Graziani stopped at Sidi Barrani, supposedly to build a supply road that would have taken months to complete. He was still 130 kilometers from the main British position at Mersa Matruh. In December of that same year, a British force of barely 30,000 soldiers under General Richard O'Connor attacked the Italians. The offensive, planned with skill, achieved total surprise, catching the Italians off guard. Panic spread through the Italian ranks when the 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, launched a frontal assault. Graziani's entire army was put to flight, chased across the desert, caught and destroyed at Baie de Fom in February 1941. Justly or unjustly, wrote a military historian, the Italian army became synonymous with martial ineptitude. And this reputation was not entirely undeserved. The problem wasn't the Italian soldiers, who often fought with courage when well led. The problem was a corrupt system that prioritized political loyalty over professional competence, that appointed generals for their fascist connections rather than their military skills. The invasion of Greece from Albania in October 1940 was another disaster Mussolini had ordered without consulting Hitler. The Greek forces, vastly inferior in number and equipment, repelled the invasion and counterattacked, pushing the Italians back to Albanian territory. It was an unprecedented humiliation for a regime that had promised to restore the glories of the Roman Empire. Hitler was furious. Mussolini's Greek adventure had complicated his strategic plans, forcing him to divert troops to the Balkans. In April 1941, Germany had to intervene to save its ally, conquering Yugoslavia and Greece in a few weeks. But this intervention delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was scheduled for May, and did not begin until the 22nd of June. Some historians argue that these crucial weeks of delay contributed to the German failure to capture Moscow before winter. From that moment on, the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler changed definitively. The Italian was no longer an ally on equal terms, but a problematic subordinate whose forces required constant German rescue. The proud Duce, who had once been the model Hitler admired and imitated, had become a burden. How did the Italian people experience this succession of defeats? At first, fascist propaganda managed to hide the magnitude of the disasters, but gradually reality filtered through. Soldiers wrote letters home, describing deplorable conditions, lack of equipment, incompetent leadership. Prisoners of war captured by the British in North Africa began to be repatriated, bringing with them stories of crushing defeats. And above all, Italian cities began to suffer Allied bombings that turned buildings into rubble and dreams into nightmares. When Allied forces landed in Sicily on the 10th of July 1943, Mussolini's mystique evaporated like water in the desert. Coastal defences collapsed rapidly. The Italian divisions, demoralised and poorly equipped, offered minimal resistance. In a few weeks, the island fell to Allied power. The invasion of metropolitan Italian territory had begun, and nothing could stop it. The Grand Council of Fascism, the supreme organ of the party that Mussolini had created and dominated for 2 decades, turned against him. In the session of July 24th, 1943, 19 of the 28 members voted in favour of a motion that withdrew his command of the armed forces and returned it to the king. The creator of fascism had been repudiated by his own creation. There was no final stand. His supporters were conspicuous by their absence, and the Duce fell with a whimper, not with a roar. This phrase perfectly captures the nature of the fascist collapse. The regime that had glorified virility, courage, the will to fight, ended without anyone firing a single shot in its defence. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel III ordered Mussolini's arrest. The dictator who had governed Italy for 21 years was taken to a military ambulance and transferred to a detention location. Italian fascism was dead, although fascists would take months to realise it. But then came the German rescue that would artificially prolong the agony. On September 12, 1943, an SS and paratrooper commando under Otto Scorzini carried out a daring operation at the Hotel Campo Imperatore, high up the Gran Sasso Massif. Silent gliders landed next to the hotel, surprising the Italian guards. Mussolini was freed and taken to Germany to meet Hitler. Whatever he was before, he was now a German puppet, who owed his own life to Hitler. This brutal but accurate assessment perfectly summarises Mussolini's situation after the rescue. He was placed at the head of the newly created Italian Social Republic in the north, sometimes called the Republic of Salo, for the small town on the shores of Lake Garda, where he established his government. But he was never more than a German satellite state, carrying out German orders, persecuting and executing anyone associated with a growing partisan movement. The Republic of Salo was also complicit in the deportation of Italian Jews to Nazi extermination camps. Before the German occupation, Italy had enacted discriminatory racial laws, but had not directly participated in the genocide. With Mussolini restored as Hitler's puppet, this changed drastically. Thousands of Italian Jews were deported to Auschwitz and other camps, of whom only a tiny fraction returned. Mussolini's final months were a twilight existence. He lived surrounded by German guards, who supposedly protected him, but in reality watched him. His health kept deteriorating. He spent hours sunk in melancholy, writing memoirs that attempted to justify his decisions, blaming everyone but himself for the disaster he had caused. In December 1944, he gave a speech at the Lyrico Theatre in Milan, his last important public appearance. It was his attempt to recapture some of the oratorical magic that had brought him to power 2 decades earlier, that style that mixed charisma and cruelty, that imposing presence that had captivated millions. He promised new weapons, imminent counter-offensives, a victory that was just around the corner. The public applauded, but the enthusiasm was forced. Everyone in the room knew they were the empty words of a dying regime. The final collapse came in April 1945, when the partisans identified him in that German truck near Dongo, when they dragged him out of his improvised hiding place, when they took him to Giuliano di Mesegra to execute him alongside Clara Petacci. The cycle was completed. The founder of European fascism, the inventor of an ideology that would cause tens of millions of deaths, ended his days in front of an iron gate, riddled by a submachine gun burst. But there is a dimension of this story that we haven't sufficiently explored yet: the impact of Italian fascism on world history. What would have happened if Mussolini had never existed? Would Hitler have risen without the Italian model to imitate? Mussolini was, without a doubt, the first fascist dictator of the 20th century in Europe. He coined the term fascism in 1919, deriving it from the Roman fasces, that symbol of authority representing a bundle of rods tied around an axe. He created the model of a single party, of personality cult, of omnipresent propaganda, of systematic political violence that Hitler would adapt for Germany. The Italian fascist regime was the laboratory where techniques were experimented with that Nazism would later take to unimaginable extremes. The creation of a political police to monitor and repress opponents, the elimination of independent trade unions and the banning of strikes, total control of the press and the use of cinema as a propaganda tool, the creation of youth organizations to indoctrinate new generations. All these elements were perfected first in Italy, before being exported to Germany and other countries. Even Mussolini's famous pose, with his chin raised and an expression of fierce determination, was imitated by dictators around the world. There were strict rules on how he could be photographed. It was forbidden to publish images of him smiling, and the word douche had to always be written in capital letters. It was said that American razor blades were inadequate to cut his supposedly tough beard. A simple slogan summed it all up: Il Duce ha sempre ragione. The Duce is always right. This personality cult, this construction of an almost divine leader embodying the will of the nation, would become the standard model for authoritarian regimes of the 20th century. Mussolini proved it was possible to convince millions of people to surrender their freedom in exchange for the promise of national glory. And yet, that entire edifice collapsed in a matter of hours when the fortunes of war changed. The same Italians who had chanted his name now kicked his corpse. The same journalists who had praised him now wrote his condemnation. The same hierarchs who had sworn eternal loyalty now voted for his dismissal. Fascism revealed its true nature. It was an illusion sustained by fear, which evaporated the moment that fear disappeared. What lessons can we extract from all this for our understanding of the current world? Are the warnings left to us by Mussolini's fall still relevant? The first lesson is about the fragility of dictatorial power. Mussolini seemed invincible for years. He controlled the state, the party, the media, the armed forces. Mass rallies showed a people seemingly united behind their leader. But this power was illusory. The moment the king withdrew his support, everything collapsed like a house of cards. The second lesson is about the dangers of vanity in political leadership. Mussolini made catastrophic decisions, driven not by strategic analysis, but by his need to look important, to compete with Hitler, to sit at the victor's table. His entry into World War II was motivated by the desire to secure easy territorial gains, not by genuine national interests. The third lesson is about the nature of alliances between authoritarian regimes. Mussolini imagined his alliance with Hitler would make him the leader of a Mediterranean empire. Instead, he ended up as a subordinate, exploited when he was useful, discarded when he ceased to be. Dictatorships do not form genuine alliances because their leaders are fundamentally incapable of trusting anyone. The fourth lesson is about citizen responsibility in democracies. Fascism did not come to power through a military coup or foreign invasion. It arrived because enough Italians supported it or tolerated it, because elites believed they could use it for their own ends, because the opposition was divided. Italian democracy died because those who should have defended it opted for complacency. King Victor Emmanuel III handed the government to Mussolini in 1922 because he believed, along with the conservative establishment, that he could use the fascists to restore order and then control them. They were fatally wrong. They did not foresee the totalitarian evolution of the regime, and when they wanted to rectify it, it was too late. When we contemplate the photographs of Piazzale Loreto, with the mutilated bodies swinging in the air, we must remember that this macabre scene was the result of choices made by ordinary people over the course of 2 decades. The crowd kicking Mussolini's corpse included many who had cheered him years earlier. The horror of that moment was in part the horror of recognition. This is what we allowed to happen. This is where we arrived. The fate of Benito Mussolini is a warning inscribed on the body of history. It reminds us that empires built on lies crumble, that grandiloquent promises end in ruin, that leaders who glorify violence often die violently. It is an uncomfortable lesson, even brutal, but absolutely necessary. Because fascism was not an accident of history, an aberrant parenthesis that we can safely forget. It was a human possibility, a response to real crises, a temptation that remains present in every society facing uncertainty and fear. As long as the conditions that made it possible exist, the risk of its return under new forms and with new names will exist. Could it happen again? That is the question every generation must ask itself. The answer depends on us, on the choices we make when the authoritarian temptation appears disguised as a simple solution to complex problems. Mussolini's corpse in Piazzale Loreto looks at us from the past, reminding us of the price of complacency, the cost of surrendering our freedom in exchange for empty promises of greatness. Today, more than 80 years after that April morning in Milan, tourists and pilgrims continue to visit both Piazzale Loreto and the crypt of Predappio. In the Milanese square, where the Esso gas station used to be, there is now a McDonald's. Some see a bitter irony in this. The temple of American capitalism, built on the site where the man who wanted to destroy the Western order died. Others simply go to eat hamburgers, without knowing what happened there 8 decades ago. A monument from 1960, a relief sculpture of Saint Sebastian created by Giannino Castiglione, marks the spot where the 15 partisans were executed in August 1944. The names of those martyrs are engraved on the back. Periodically, someone leaves flower wreaths or a bottle of wine at its base. It is a discreet reminder that before being the scene of Mussolini's end, that place was the scene of the beginning of his fall. And in Predappio, neo-fascists keep arriving every year, giving the Roman salute, wearing black shirts, leaving messages of admiration in the crypt's guest book. It is a disturbing spectacle that Italy doesn't know how to handle. Would banning the visits violate freedom of movement? Does tolerating them normalize fascism? The dilemma remains unresolved. That was all for this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming content on the most shocking moments in history. Leave in the comments what other historical leaders you would like us to analyse in depth. Do you think the lessons of fascism remain relevant for today's world? Did you know the story of the theft of Mussolini's corpse? Tell us your opinion. See you next episode.